you got your Bibles, then you're doing it right. If you don't got your Bible, we've got one for you. Take it home and bring it back next week. How about that? And open up to the book of Titus, please. You know what they say, when the pastor's away, the church will pray. What were you thinking, Arnie? What were you thinking, Arnie? The church will pray. Bunch of heathens. Yeah. Okay, so we are in the book of Titus. We're trying to make it through the book before Aragon comes back. I don't know. If we don't, it's okay. So we looked at chapter 1, and we read the whole letter last week. And remember, we remember that this was written as a letter from Paul to Titus, and so we read the whole thing last week. We won't do that this week, but we're gonna pick it up where we left off in verse 5. We're gonna read down through the end of the chapter. So, if you found Titus, it's a little book near the end of the whole Bible. Hopefully you found it by now. You can stand and we're going to read these verses together. Even though this is a letter from Paul to Titus, we know that it was inspired by the Lord and authoritative even over our lives. Verse 5, the reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. An elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Since an overseer manages God's household, he must be blameless, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, not violent, not pursuing dishonest gain. Rather, he must be hospitable, one who loves what is good, one who is self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as it has been taught so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. For there are many rebellious people, full of meaningless talk and deception, especially those of the circumcision group. They must be silenced because they are disrupting whole households by teaching things that they ought not to teach, and that for the sake of dishonest gain. Verse 12. One of Crete's own prophets has said it, Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. This saying is true, therefore rebuke them sharply so that they will be sound in the faith and will pay no attention to Jewish myths or to the merely human commands of those who reject the truth. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are corrupted and do not believe, nothing is pure. In fact, both their minds and consciences are corrupted. They claim to know God, but by their actions they deny him. They are detestable, disobedient, and unfit for doing anything good. This is God's word. You can be seated. It's a very straightforward passage. So, I don't, like I've said before, you don't ever want to oversimplify something complicated, but you also don't want to overcomplicate something simple. So the real thrust of this passage is that Paul left Titus in Crete in order to, quote, set things straight or set things in order. And what this means is that there was a work that had been done. I mean, you have to remember Acts 2 when the day of Pentecost happened, and there was a lot of people that happened to be in Jerusalem because they were there to celebrate probably the Passover before, but then they were there for the feast for Pentecost and for this Jewish festival. It says that there were people from all over the place. Well, Crete was one of the areas that was listed there in Acts 2 if you read it. And so I think it stands to reason that there may have been some believers or descendants, very close associated believers that Titus would be talking to from that event at Pentecost. So it seems like there has been believers in Crete for a while. And when Paul was there, he had some fruitful ministry there, but that it was incomplete. There wasn't an established church there to the point that it was self-sufficient and kind of, really settled. And so while the work had been started, obviously there were believers there. Obviously there were believers there that were, that there was a group of believers. It was more than just a few. There was still some orderliness that needed to be put into place, and that was Titus's job. And so everything in this letter is Paul telling Titus what to do to the church or what to tell to the church or what to set in place at the church in order for the church's orderliness so that it could function well and be healthy. The word sound that you'll see in this letter multiple times: sound teaching, sound living. That word sound is kind of the same word used for health. It's to be healthy and whole. And so that's what Paul is getting at. That's what he's hoping for this church, and he sends Titus there in order to bring that about. So that's why I titled this Setting Things Straight Part 1, because, again, the whole letter is Paul telling Titus how to set this church on a firm foundation for its success in the future. The first example of this, the way that the church is going to be able to flourish, is it's going to need leadership. It's going to need leadership, elders, overseers. And those words are used interchangeably. So he says that you need elders. And I broke this down into three sort of components in order to be able to identify an elder. Now, before we go any farther, let's realize Paul is telling Titus what to look for in someone who could be an elder. The reason that's important is because it wasn't up to Titus to ask someone if they'd like to be an elder and then for that person to brag on how qualified that they are. It seems to me that, there's an old joke, right? If you have to say you're a lady, maybe you're not one, right? I mean, there's some things that should be self-evident. You shouldn't have to say it. If you're, somebody who's truly a leader is a leader because it turns out there's people following them, not because they said that they're a leader, dang it, and stomped their foot on the ground, right? That's what Titus is supposed to be able to do here. He's supposed to be able to recognize the godliness in someone's life such that they are a leader with or without the title. They are there. Somebody asked me recently if there was a specific example, but they said, if you ever became a head pastor, would you do such and such? And I said, hopefully not. If I'm not doing it now, I shouldn't be doing it then. And if I am doing it now, my point was there should be a seamless transition. Hopefully nothing will change if in whatever position I'm in, I'm just the person, and then it will be recognized whether I'm qualified or not, and if not, I need to step down, and if I am, then we can get into giftings and see if that's there as well. And then that's who's supposed to be in the office. So it's important to recognize that it's Titus's job to recognize these qualities in the man's life. So the first of these qualities is that these are supposed to be men of a God-honoring home life. Now, I know that, already as you read this, let's rewind. Anytime you read the Bible, we realize we're reading text from a different day and age. And that's one of the difficulties with reading the Bible and applying it to our life is we have to sort of, use a filter or a strainer to see, what things were applicable to that time and that time only, and then what other principles actually translate to today. Well, one of the things that you find out when you read this, and also in 1 Timothy 3, when you see the qualifications of an elder, is it seems that even though today guys will become Christians at 15, 16 years old or whatever, 17, and they're really living it out, and so they stand out as they ought to amongst their peers. And so since they are Christians and since they seem to be remarkable amongst their peers, well, maybe they should get into ministry, as a career when they turn 18, 19, 20 years old. And so you send them off to college for 9 months or however, 12 months, whatever the bare minimum is, and then you give them a church. And then they're calling the shots for everybody and everything at 19 years old, And if they're good at it, what you like to think you could see is that they just become a superstar where all the glory goes to them as they humbly try to redirect it, and say that it's all God. But the point I'm getting at here is that nowadays it's seen as a height of achievement to have as much spotlight on you as possible as soon as possible. It seems to me when you read Titus and you read Timothy that even me at 34 years old now am an anomaly or is something different. It's not what's most likely to be looked at when it comes to who should be elder in a church. The word elder is, it kind of refers to somebody who's elderly, right? Elder. And that's purposeful. That's there's a history of that in Jewish life, that when you read back through the Old Testament, you'll see that there were a council of elders that operated in the community as judges, as those that granted wisdom and also helped to arbitrate between, who was right and wrong and mediate between conflicts and that. It's because there's, most of the time anyway, there's an inherent wisdom that comes with living some life, some experience, and having gone through some things, and having raised some kids, and having, been, married for an extended amount of time. That there's no substitute for by reading books or by listening to stories. I mean, the best thing a young person can do is shut their mouth and listen to people older than them and ask questions. And so I would say that when you see a young man or a young woman who is prone to do that, and they're acknowledging their limitation and trying to associate with people older than them, that is a mark of maturity. That's somebody that you notice is kind of beyond their years. But the fact of the matter is, that's the closest they can get to actually having lived life and gone through and got the bumps and bruises. And so when the first sort of qualification here, the first category, has to do with the home life, it's clear that this is talking about somebody older who has been married for a while and has raised some kids. This isn't somebody with a 2-year-old and a 9-month-old. Not to say that can't happen, obviously, but the tendency and the pattern in the New Testament church was that these were older men, it seems like. And just as a side note, as the exception, we remember that Timothy was young because Paul spoke about Timothy's youth often and tried to push him out of being so timid. And let nobody despise you because of your youth is one of the things he told him. So we know that there was a place for young men coming up in the ministry. But as a matter of practice, most of the time it was elderly gentlemen. So it says in verse 6, an elder must be blameless, that is to say innocent, faultless. You're not going to look at that guy, and he's not easily accused. A lot of the accusations don't stick because he just has this consistency and faithfulness in his life. But first and foremost at home. It says faithful to his wife, or husband of one wife. This is not to say that they just merely need to be married to one woman at a time, so that way you can, he could be married to a woman for a couple of years, kind of sick of that one, get another one, and as long as it's just one at a time, then it's okay. That's not what it's getting at. It's also not getting at, I don't think it's only getting at that they need to be a husband of one wife as opposed to a husband of 4 wives. I think what it's getting at here is, just like the NIV decided to translate it, faithful to his wife. So not only not committing adultery, but I would say not flirtatious, not given to a wandering eye, but is faithful to his wife. He knows where home is. And then secondly, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. This is the reason why I think this is talking about an older man, is because when you read the other translations, somebody else may have another translation here, where it says not given to riots or not living a debauched life. Those are different type of translations of this. Those are not the type of accusations that are given to a 4-year-old or an 8-year-old. Those are the type of charges or type of reputations that a grown adult, a grown child, could have. And so an elder's children grown children, I'm making that distinction, ought not to have those type of reputations. I wrote here, grown, professing, and living consistent with the faith. That's what this is getting at when it says, when it's talking about the elder's children. So the responsibility of a home's spiritual health is on the man. And when it comes to Titus in this case, or whoever the pastor-seeking committee is in a church or whatever, when it comes to that, there ought to be, number one, a visibility of the man standing in the home. I mean, I know I had a youth pastor one time that seemed to be have a real extra private home life as he conducted his ministry. Now, while there needs to be boundaries in ministry, because I had another youth pastor who was the opposite, who had no boundaries, and he would say constantly to all of his youth, my door is always open, my phone's always on. And his wife would attest, the door was always open, and the phone was always on. And there was no boundaries at all. And that was a real strain on their family life. But this other youth pastor, while there should be boundaries and limitations, it shouldn't be that the family is so isolated so that you can't even examine what the family is like. Because that's part of the qualifications. That's an attestation to the quality of the man. Why? Because the responsibility of a man's home falls ultimately, finally, on the man. Is the wife responsible for some things and her own actions and all that? Of course. Are the kids responsible for their own actions? Of course. But all of that is under the umbrella of the man and his responsibility, in the same way that, say, like on a job site, everybody's got their own role and their responsibilities, and they can fail in their own. They need to learn to stay in their own lane, and they can do better or worse at that. But above that is the manager, and his job is to sort of monitor all those different lanes and make sure people are in order. That's the headship of a male in the home. Leadership 101. Leadership is not defined first and foremost by rights and privileges. That's why people get so offended at the idea of a man being the head of the household, because they're thinking, well, how come he gets to? Leadership's not about the gets to. There is some of that. That's a perk. But leadership is first and foremost about the have to. I have to make sure that things are going as they're supposed to be going here. It's first and foremost responsibility. And so when it comes to an elder, a good indication of what type of responsibility and leadership he's going to execute in the church is what type of responsibility and leadership he's executed in his own home. That's the first place of management for a potential elder. Secondly, not just what he's produced in his home that you can observe, but also what he's produced even within himself, what emanates from him. He's to be a man of deep character. There's a few different characteristics of this. I'll just read them because they're all pretty plain. I mean, the translations are accurate, and so they get the point across. It says in verse 7, since an overseer manages God's household, which is a reference back to, we know he's managed his own household well, right? Well, he's going to manage God's household now. He must be blameless. That's the second time it said that. Blameless, innocent, manifestly above reproach, above criticisms. Not perfect, but reputable. He must be blameless, not overbearing. It's pretty straightforward. He's not overbearing. He's not wielding his leadership as something to beat over the head other people with. Not overbearing, not quick-tempered. It's pretty important, so keep that in mind. Let's think of a couple of examples of when someone could be quick-tempered. One is when they're accused. Two is when the accusation might be true. When a man has actually made a mistake, and maybe you bring it to his attention. Is it received? Are they overly defensive, overreactive? Not given to drunkenness. That's different than, apparently Jesus seeming to have drank some wine at a party. But given to drunkenness, it's a lack of self-control. Well, it's a lack of self-control of a specific type. Not violent, not pursuing dishonest gain. That's one side of the coin, all the things that he's to not be. So there's a red flags when you see them. But there's also there's another side of this coin of what a man is supposed to look like. It's not just what they're not supposed to do, as if they're just supposed to be a monk that just sits in a corner somewhere all day, every day, not doing things and being really good at not doing. It says in verse 8, rather, he must be hospitable, one who loves what is good. I guess, I didn't comment at all on the not violent and not pursuing dishonest gain. So when it says here, one who loves what is good, I would set that in contrast to one who is not violent. There is the type of man who likes, and this is innate to being masculine, it's to be aggressive. I mean, females are aggressive also, but it's expressed in a different way. An elder is not supposed to be, there's too many people laughing at the women being aggressive. There is. We were commenting to each other. Yeah. But an elder is not supposed to like the fight. They're not supposed to, to enjoy the conflict. I mean, it even says that in 1 Timothy 3 when it comes to, when he's talking about the qualifications of an elder there, that, they need to be able to rise to the occasion when it's necessary, but not looking for a fight. Not quarrelsome is what it says in 1 Timothy 3. That's what it's getting at here, I think. And so the contrast of that is one who rather loves good. He doesn't love just the drama for the sake of drama. He actually loves what's good. He's what Jesus would call a peacemaker, who is like their Father in heaven. Blessed are the peacemakers, because they're like their Father. So the elder is to be a lover of what's good. That is, things that are holy, things that are true, peace among men. Hospitable. He opens his home. Loves what is good, who is self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. And that's really, these are just synonyms or translations of those words, upright, holy, and disciplined. Upright is getting at innocent before God and man, as I've said over and over already. I guess the added point there is not just upright before men, which he ought to be, but is upright before God. That means that an elder, believe it or not, needs to actually be a believer, a real believer. He needs to have he needs to have standing with the Lord. Holy, what that's getting at here, is sanctioned by a higher law. See, you need an elder, you need a man who is not given to the praise of man, who's truly trying to do what's pleasing to the Lord. You know what you'll see in a godly man, or godly woman for that matter, is you'll see them do things sometimes that are somewhat out of character. And here's what I mean by that. Even though we're being conformed to the image of the Son, that's how it says it in Romans chapter 8, we're being transformed by the renewing of our mind, in Romans 12. We're being changed from the inside out. We talked about that last time. That's what godliness is talking about. Not just behavior modification on the surface, like doing something that is different, but that's springing from an inward change, right? Now, while that's the case, what we cannot do is just wait until we get that feeling and that motivation in order to do what's right. Sometimes you just know what's right, and it's within your physical capacity to do so, even if your heart needs to catch up later. That's what you'll see in a godly man, one who is qualified for an elder. Sometimes you know that this man's tendency is, I'll use myself as an example. Here's an example. I know that my tendency is to be late to things. You all know that too. I know. Now, maybe wherever I'm late to, the people are gracious and, it's just, it's not a big deal. It's a couple minutes. But if I'm a man of true Christian conviction, I'm sanctioned by a higher law. That's what it's getting at when it says a man who's holy. I'm a man who wants to please the Lord, not just men, which means even if men say, it's okay, it's not that big of a deal, there still ought to be some conviction in me that wants to say, if I'm going to be a little late or I have to be way early, because I've done this in spurts of my life to try to get over this, I'll show up somewhere a half hour early. Because I can't, if I wait so I can get there 5 minutes early, I'm going to be 4 minutes late. So I've tried to why? Because they don't expect me to be there a half hour early, but because I'm trying to strive for this higher goal that's higher than just being good enough for you, but trying to be good enough for him, I see the being late. This is kind of a minor example. Nobody's too hurt by that. It's just kind of annoying. It's like a paper cut, and you do it enough, and then it's like, knock it off, But Jesus said, be a man of your word, basically, right? Let your yes be yes, let your no be no. I see as an extraction from that, if we set a time for something, then that's like saying we've agreed that we're going to be there at that time. So an extrapolation of that command to let your yes be yes and your no be no, it's to be somewhere when you say you're going to be somewhere. And so I feel constricted by that no matter how much leniency I get from other people, right? So that's what you're looking for in an elder, is somebody who is going beyond what's going to be just approved by others, although, there need to be a man above reproach, but is actually shooting for an even higher goal of pleasing the Lord. There's some times where other people might pat you on the back while that man is still thinking, yeah, but I wanted to get a little higher because I'm trying to please the Lord. That's what we're looking for in a man. That's what he's getting at when he says holy. So innocent before God and man, that's talking about being upright. Sanctioned by a higher law, that's the long tangent I went on right there. That's referring to a man being holy. He's constrained by what God expects of him, and he's pursuing that. And then lastly, mastered from within. That would be an elaboration on the word disciplined, which it says at the end there. This man is to be upright, holy, and disciplined. So, again, I think that's pretty straightforward, but mastered from within is compelled from the inside, not just coerced from the outside. That's what's to be characteristic of an elder. All these traits. Then at the end of that, at the verse, in verse 9. So we've talked about the men of a God-honoring home life, men of deep character, but then they also need to be men of the word. It says, he must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as it has been taught, so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. This man is not only to have, for lack of a better word, an impressive family, one that impresses upon people that man, manages his household well. He's not only supposed to be impressive himself, meaning that you could see in that man a man of deep character, but he also needs to be capable. See, it's not just the characteristics, it's the skills. There needs to be an ability to take God's truth and then be able to convey that to others, and not only just convey it to others, but be able to spot when something's inconsistent with that truth and then point it out. A man of the word needs to be clear with the word, and then also have conviction from the word. Clear, it says, because he needs to be able to encourage others by sound doctrine. When I first started preaching, I'd go to some church or whatever, and then I'd come back, and my old pastor, Jim, or even Aragon, he would say, how did it go? And for a long time, I didn't really know what to say. And then I realized, because as I thought about it, I thought, okay, so how can I evaluate whether it went well, Because the purpose, first and foremost, is to try to help the congregation. I mean, it needs to be impactful. And, so I used to answer like this. I used to say, well, we'll see, I mean, time will tell. I don't know. Maybe you help somebody, maybe not. But I don't know how they're going to apply it to their life. But then after a while, I started to realize here's a couple metrics. One, the teaching needs to be accurate. Two, it needs to be clear, because it doesn't matter if what I'm saying is accurate. Sometimes in order to be accurate, you need a longer and more complicated word, which technically is more accurate to what's trying to be said, but nobody knows that word. So then it's not clear. So I could say I'm really super accurate, but nobody understood it. But it was sound doctrine. So no, it needs to be accurate, yes, but it also needs to be clear. Why? Because the purpose, as Paul says, is they need to be able to encourage others by sound doctrine. And so that's what I need to seek to do. That's what all elders need to seek to do. They need to be able to have a good enough grasp on the truth in order to make it clear to others and keep it as accurate. But then secondly, they have to have conviction with that truth. And the reason why you have to have conviction with that truth is because it doesn't make any difference if I can communicate, or if any elder can communicate a truth and make it clear to somebody, if they're okay to sit down and have those people they just taught be taught the exact opposite and then just leave it up to the congregation without any correction. If if an elder can teach the word, they need to, and if they're going to be an elder, if a man can teach the word and they're going to be an elder, they need to also be persuaded and convinced that this word is life-changing and that this word is, most importantly, authoritative, meaning that he himself, as well as the people he's teaching, are bound by this word. He has to have that conviction, because if he doesn't, then he will never step up to the plate to correct someone when they're challenging that teaching. See, I'm not just sharing some things to think about. I mean, there are some things that are just sort of thought-provoking that are an aside to the main message, but the main message, and we're going to see this throughout this letter, this is all setting up what Titus is told to do by Paul, which is to command people in the church to do such and such. And he says that over and over again. Paul is charging Titus to go and charge the church with things they need to do in order to set the church straight. So there is an authoritativeness, an authority that comes with the teaching of the word. And so therefore, if somebody comes to compete with that teaching, Titus needs to be the type of man and needs to pick other types of men who will tell someone when to shut up and sit down. Because that's not what's happening here. And that's exactly what he gets into in verse 10. So now you know what elders look like, or what they ought to look like. But remember, the purpose of elders, the reason why Titus is told to pick elders, is so that we can set the church in order, so that we can continue the work that Paul started. So here's the need. These believers here in Crete, they needed apostolic leadership. Remember last week, as we read the introduction from Paul, we realized that the introduction is more than just a dear Titus. It's Paul asserting his authority, not in a vain way, but very clearly that he is an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. Remember, he said that he was a slave to God, but then he went on to say that he's an apostle of the Lord Jesus. He knows that he has no rights to himself. All of his rights have been sold over to God, but that in that, God has saw fit to make Paul an apostle, which has a specific function. His specific function is to bring the truth of God's word and sort of the new development in that word, which is that Jesus is the Messiah that was always promised in the Old Testament. Paul's job is to convince people of that, and then to lead people in what it means to love and live for Jesus. So what this church at Crete needed was to be directed that way by this is what's called apostolic teaching. They needed to be brought into line with Paul's teaching. Why? Because Paul was an apostle. Not all these other Jewish people that were in their community at Crete that may have, for one reason or another, gained a following. Those weren't the ones that were supposed to be followed. It was the apostle that needed to be followed. And it's the same way today. Apostolic teaching is not put forward anymore by Paul himself. I mean, he's not here anymore. It's not by John himself, but it's by Titus, right? Paul wrote to Titus, and then Titus raised up these elders, and their whole job is to protect what was passed down by the apostles who received what they got from Jesus himself. Remember in the communion passage we read every single time in 1 Corinthians 11, what's the first thing in that passage? The first thing in that passage is, "For I delivered to you what I received." And that's all that Paul did. He was constantly delivering what he received. From who? From the Lord Jesus himself. This is all of the teaching that happens in the church, even up until this day, is within the stream of apostolic teaching. And that's what this church needed. That's what Paul said this church needed. Now, I don't know why I put this quote here. I just knew it was a good quote, and I wanted to put it somewhere. So I think I meant to put this a little later, or maybe a little earlier, who knows. But I thought this was good. This is from Tony Blair, who was the Prime Minister of UK at one point. He said, "The art of leadership is saying no, not saying yes." It's easy to say yes. This goes back to the to what an elder needs to be able to do. He needs to be able to stand up and say, no, that's actually wrong. That's not where we're going. And these believers needed apostolic leadership. That's what they needed. Christianity, so in verse 10 here, he says, "For there are many rebellious people full of meaningless talk and deception, especially those of the circumcision group." So there were people within this community that were starting to lead the people astray. Whether they were formal teachers or not, I'm of the persuasion that they probably weren't, because it seems like there weren't elders there. There were just a group of people without set leadership. And so we all know what happens when there's a vacuum of leadership. Well, there's somebody will start to fill that gap. And so somebody was starting to speak up. Verse 11, it says, "They must be silenced." They must be silenced. That's how they need to be handled. That's the type of authority that we're talking about, that Paul had, and now he was conferring to Titus when he sent Titus, or left Titus at Crete. They must be silenced. And then this same responsibility would be passed down to these elders that that Titus was to establish. Now it's your job to silence fools like this. And here's why: because it's not like false teaching doesn't have an effect. True teaching, we hope and expect, has an effect on people, that they become conformed to the truth. Well, then what do you think happens if you let false teaching run rampant? Well, then you end up having people that are misled into falsehoods. That's why it's such a problem. It's not true teaching is effective and false teaching is ineffective. It's neutral. It's not neutral. That's the whole threat. They must be silenced because they are disrupting whole households by teaching things that they ought not to teach. It was a disruption. And that for the sake of dishonest gain. So even while they're wreaking havoc within the church and disturbing people's peace and reconciliation with God, or the clear conscience that they may have had, they seem to be lining their pockets or somehow receiving gain off of this. Now, verse 12, it says, I kind of rambled. So, I was going to make the point that Christianity did have a struggle with Judaism as it emerged. That's just a fact. The Christianity was seen as a sect or an offshoot of Judaism for a long time. And so, as you read through all of the New Testament, especially all the letters of Paul, all the references, for example, of like meat sacrificed to idols, that was a concern that especially the Jews would have toward Gentiles that maybe were associated with sort of paganism or idolatry. All the conversation about circumcision, that's even what's referred to here, that's a reference to the Jews. Those of the circumcision group. That was a mark of a sign of the covenant. That was actually a delineating factor between what are called like God-fearing Gentiles and Jews. God-fearing Gentiles maybe paid some sort of homage to the God of the Jews, but they weren't going to go so far as to become circumcised because, for obvious reasons. But they would still be sort of counted as part of the community, but not quite Jews. And so this was a huge battle within the early church, and it's actually the whole reason why Paul ended up being finally imprisoned at the end of Acts in the first place. So I'll just read this. This was the accusation that they had lobbed toward Paul. It says, "When the 7 days were nearly over," this was the 7 days of an oath that he made to try to appease some Jews. It says this: "Some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple." That's the holy site for the Jews, right? "They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting," what? What were they shouting about Paul that was so controversial? Because remember, Christianity, I wrote on the sign this last week, the gospel is good news. Nevertheless, you have all these people getting killed for it. So why is it good news but so controversial that people aren't just being argued with, but even killed for, at least back in this time? Well, here's the accusations of this specific case. It says, these were the Jews, what they said about Paul, their fellow Jew. "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place." That's their beef. Their beef is that whatever Paul's preaching, it's against what the Jews stand for. what did he say? Against their people, against our people and our law and this place, referring to the temple. And besides, he's brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place. I just cite that just to point out that this was part of the rift even in Crete. It seems like it was prevalent in every Christian church that was established. There was some sort of conflict between the Jews and the Gentiles, and how the Gentiles' standing was established in this with the Jews. And so, if I'm a Gentile in this church alongside some Jews, and then there's some really hardcore Jews that say, yeah, maybe Jesus is, maybe he's legit or whatever, but you guys are still Gentiles. You can see how that would start to disrupt and disturb the unity within the church, as well as maybe even within some households over whether or not these Gentile converts are true converts. Well, I guess we'll skip the Romans 14 passage. That's just another example of Jew and Gentile coexistence in the church, and you can read that on your own if you'd like to. But these people not only needed to be corrected out of the Jewish-Gentile sort of controversy, but they also needed to be corrected out of what I'll call the Cretan way, the culture that they were living in. So while there would have been probably Jews and Gentiles in the same church, there would have been a conflict over some being not being circumcised, and so therefore not being part of, they're not quite God's people. But then on top of that, they were coming out of a culture that is marked by this quote from Epimenides, who is a philosopher and a poet. He said this: Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. See, Paul agreed with that. He said, this saying is true. That's the type of culture that's known among the Cretans. And so as Paul is sending Titus into this church that lives within this culture, he speaks to the tendencies that these believers may have coming out of that culture. There's a reason why people across the world from us really hate America. Really actively hate America. And it's for things that we totally take for granted. Why? Because we're a part of the culture. And I have a feeling if there was a Paul who was sending a Titus to South Bend First Baptist Church, there's probably some expectations that he would have that he thinks he would find in this church that he would be warning us against. Why? Because we're in the American culture. And there's some things that we take for granted that maybe need to be critiqued. Same thing in other cultures. And so as Paul is speaking to Titus and sending him into Crete, he's saying, these are the type of people that these believers are coming out of. And so they're going to have certain tendencies, and you need to speak to that. You need to charge them if we're going to set this church straight. And so in verse 13, he says, this saying is true, and this is a prescription. This is what you got to do, Titus. This is what you got to do, knowing who these people are and where they come from. Rebuke them sharply. Sometimes the doctor's just got to break the bone. You can't massage bones back into place. Sometimes things are so broken that it's got to be direct. It's got to be forthright. You just got to get to the heart of the issue. And there are people in the church that need to do that. And then in this case, that's what Titus needs to do, and then set up elders or raise up elders that can do the same thing. Like I said a second ago, and like we'll see in the rest of the letter, Titus is commanded by Paul to command others to do things. Rebuke them sharply. Why? So that their feelings are really, really hurt. And then so it says, so that they will be sound in the faith. It's always toward health. The doctor breaks the bone to reset it. It's for the good of the patient. Something I love about Paul. Paul will be super hardcore, but it's always with the best intentions, or the tenderness behind it. Therefore, rebuke them sharply so that they will be sound in the faith and will pay no attention to Jewish myths or to the merely human commands of those who reject the truth. So if Titus goes into this context and he's willing to be bold and forthright and follow the instructions that Paul will give following this passage, not only will they be strengthened against the tendencies they have from the culture, but they can be strengthened also against those false teachings that are starting to sort of percolate in the community, in that Christian community, these Jewish myths. The point there in the lot, he says these people needed guidance out of the Cretan way, but not by external religious formality. Meaning, what I was getting at there is that maybe these, Judaism, which is the religion of the Jews, is very, very, very heavily leans on the acts of people. You know, that's why they say that the book of James is like the Jewish book in the New Testament. And it's no surprise then that he's so much about action. Whereas Christianity and the teachings of Christ, what we talk about a lot, is for our mind to be changed and for our heart to be converted. It's all the inner life type stuff. Judaism was very heavily, they heavily emphasized the actions of people. And so what I was thinking about in this church is that if you have these former Cretans, that are maybe very worldly. I mean, it says that they were lazy gluttons, evil brutes, and always liars. If you have those type of people starting to come into the church and say that they're Christians, and then you have them alongside a bunch of Jews, you could see the Jews, imposing the law upon these Gentiles to change their behaviors. Should they change their behaviors? Well, yeah. But it's more like the way that Jesus said, which in Matthew 12:33 goes like this: make a tree good, and then its fruit will be good. Don't just pluck the apples off and staple some pears on, and call it a pear tree. Make the tree good, and then the tree will produce good fruit. That's the way that's supposed to be. But again, that's Titus's job, is to come in and say, no. Being circumcised is not going to make you a non-Cretan and then therefore God's people. It's not just the external changes. Yes, you need to do away with those Cretan bad habits, but no, you don't need to just become a Jew in order to really be God's people. Instead, I'm going to have the gospel bear upon your life, and that was Titus's job. Here's the takeaways. Number one, without apostolic teaching, a church is bound to follow after the cultural norms in which it's found, kind of like the church there at Crete. But if the Apostle Paul wasn't going to convey his message in the first place when he was at Crete, but then leaving somebody there to forward that work, what would have happened is that the Cretans, even as believers, they may have just fallen back into the habits of being of Cretan culture, maybe with some Jewish modifications. Next, the church is always susceptible to being misled by false teaching. It's always susceptible to that. So the remedy for both these things, of falling to cultural norms or falling to false teaching when somebody wants to take some obscure passage in 2 Chronicles and start saying what God says about that, the cure to both of those things is apostolic teaching, going back to the New Testament, seeing what the apostles and the writers of the gospel have said, and taking what's clear and then measuring everything up against that which is clear throughout the New Testament that the apostles taught. Because again, Jesus specifically commissioned those apostles to go out into the world, and they've left that teaching for us, and that's our standard now. The church is always susceptible to being misled by false teaching, so we need to stay tethered to the apostles' teaching. And lastly, the local church needs qualified and competent leadership. That's God's order. God's always raised up leaders for his people, not just a confederation of people. If you want to see what happens when God's people wander around without leadership, read the book of Judges. And what happens in the book of Judges over and over and over again? Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then God raised up a leader, temporary leader, a judge, and there was some consolidation or whatever the word is, unity. And there was some success, and then it falls back into everybody did what was right in their own eyes. God has always set leadership over his people, and then held that leadership to a higher standard. But it's in order to bring a soundness to the community. Let's pray. Father in heaven, I do pray over this specific flock. And I ask, God, you would make this church a sound church, one that's well-rounded, one that's balanced, that knows how to evangelize, and knows how to disciple, knows how to pray, knows how to preach. I pray, God, that we would operate in all of what that you've intended for us to operate in. We want this church to be healthy, with healthy relationships, a love for one another that is without hypocrisy, as your word says. Lord, I want to see the saints here equipped to do the work of the ministry, just as your word commands. And so, Lord, would you bless Aragon and I as we look for other leaders in this church? And Lord, I pray that you would provide more leadership. And also, God, I pray that this church would not only be mature in and of ourselves, but also effective in this community.